perhaps we could start from the idea of Brixton as a home. Lots of people, when I've spoken to people about you, lots of people in Brixton have claimed you. Yes, he's from Brixton, he's one of us. And I'm wondering, for you, do you see Brixton that way? Does it feel like a home to you, or a place that was a home for you?
Yes, Brixton was for a long time my home, but Brixton extends from, Brixton is actually SW2, but most people think of Brixton as SW9. In Jamaica, when I wrote to my father in 1956, it was Brixton SW9. But in truth, when I became a postman, I realized that Brixton's not SW9, it's actually SW2. So Brixton then incorporates parts of SW2 and SW9, which extends as far down as Vassal Road. That was all known as Brixton. And that's where the community, a large part of the early community, lived. I arrived in Brixton, or in England, on the 1st of September 1957, and was taken to number 3 Geneva Road. Now, Geneva Road was where the barrier block is now. It ran parallel to Somerleyton Road. So the first 6 months of my life in Britain was at number 3 Geneva Road, where I then kind of explored outwards into all other parts of London, into the West End, into North London, and so on. So Brixton is essentially my home. I moved away for a while and lived over in West London, in Shepherd's Bush, for about 10 years, and I came back to Brixton. This is the SW2 part of Brixton, in the 1977. So yeah, Brixton has always been that place that, but the thing is, because I'm a Jamaican, and most of the people who came up on the Empire Windrush in 1948 ended up in Brixton. There's 492, and there were a couple of women, and the majority of those people on that ship came from Jamaica. They were, they docked at Tilbury and was brought to the air raid shelters in Clapham South. From there, they were then rehoused in Somerleyton Road and Geneva Road, which were the main two kind of areas. I think they were owned by the Church of England, and there was something to do with the change in the rent agreement that the landlords had with the tenants. So there was less control, and so they then brought all these people in, bunged them into these two streets, and I arrived some 9 years later. I lived in a house where there were 4 floors, no bath, 1 toilet in the basement with no windows, no door, and there were 20-odd people living in the room, living in the house. The room we were in had myself, my younger brother, and my father in a double bed, which he rented, and there were 3 other beds in the room, single beds with single men. My mother lived 2 floors down in a room with another friend from Jamaica. And that was my kind of introduction to England. And I felt it was the worst experience of my life, because I was a young man, aged 14, just discovering the world, the beauty of life and understanding things, understanding love, relationships, and so on. Was dragged away from that into this thing, which was really an awful experience. You know, being September, it was the beginning of autumn. And in those days, before the Clean Air Act, which banned the use of certain kind of fuel for heating, you know, certain times from October onwards, you'd have these huge, thick pea soupers that would black out everything for days. You couldn't see anything. And so this was the England, and chimneys with smoke coming out of, and in the Caribbean, the only time you see a chimney is at a factory, somewhere like a slaughterhouse where they burn off stuff, or where they were producing things. So it was a very odd and strange place to come into in my early teens. However, we spent 6 months there, and in that 6 months, I got to know a lot of people because, most people knew each other because they might come from a village. Because you're in Jamaica, you decided to go to England, you ask someone if they knew anybody in England. And they said, well, yes, I have a cousin in Brixton. Here's his or her address. You go there. So a whole village would come up and live in an area where everybody knew each other. So that was the beginning of the community. So you had Jamaicans and 1 or 2 Barbadians and Grenadans. And then over in West London, you have people from Trinidad, Grenada, more Eastern European. So, what am I saying? Eastern European? Eastern Caribbean, right? And so there was a commonality being Jamaican, a lot of them from the countryside, but a lot of them came from Kingston. Kingston, as you know, that was the capital, and it's the place where all the hustling goes on. Yeah, we have a word that we use for hustling, scuffling. Now, to scuffle is like to have some kind of encounter in that kind of way. But to scuffle in Jamaican parlance is to hustle in a small time way. Yeah? So you have gamblers, they're always playing dice and some kind of crown and anchor, some kind of, and they were on the waterfront. And a lot of the early guys stowed away and came here, right? And they were the rough guys on the waterfront. And a lot of them came to Brixton and they brought that culture of scuffling. You throw some dice up against the wall and that was that. And so that culture ended up in Summerlayton Road for some unknown reason. So you had gambling houses, shebeens, which we used to call shubeen. In Jamaica, it's shubeen. But if you look in the dictionary, it's shebeen, which is an illegal drinking place. Because in those days, you couldn't get a license. And some people were brave enough to break the law regardless. And they'd have the place where you could go and drink, listen to the early sound system music, gamble. That generation of people, however, didn't stay very long because they were able to scuffle, make enough money and go back to Jamaica. People like my parents, they were afraid to spit on the pavement because there were so many rules, laws, regulations. In the Caribbean, it's much freer. There are laws, but nobody knows what the laws are. It's the law that governs is the kind of interrelationship, yeah? Those laws. But here, it's massive amounts of laws. If you do this, it's against the law. If you do that. So most of the people simply was like this, and they went to work, came back home, but then you had the scufflers who made the money, who created the culture. So the culture of Brixton is not the culture of, say, Tottenham, yeah? Because the people in Tottenham are like that. People in Brixton were busted open. You understand? And that's what they did. They set up their own forms of entertainment. Because in those days, Britain practiced what was called a colour bar, right? And the colour bar was very subtle, like a lot of things British. It's not like apartheid in South Africa. It's not like segregation in the United States. But it's a colour bar. And you have to tread really carefully to find out who actually practices a colour bar. So if you're going to a hotel, you don't just walk in and you have to find out if they practice the colour bar, because you could go in there and stand up for hours and no one takes any notice of you. So psychologically, it was really very difficult to kind of, in terms of social relationship and interrelationship between ourselves and the indigenous people. So you had to be, so you set up your own thing. But the government would not give you a license. Because license, you have to pay taxes, you have to account for this, you have to, and these people didn't have all that kind of infrastructure that the state would trust to give them a license. So they broke the law. They continually broke the law, right through until Carnival in Notting Hill, where people would just bring their alcohol and sell it on the street, and eventually the government capitulated and allowed them some kind of temporary license to sell on the street. And now all of that loosening up of the licensing law was all around that. Because you'd be at a party, we used to call it a blues party. You've heard of the blues party, based on, because most of the early music was based on American blues music. And that's what we brought with us, and that was the kind of bread and butter of the music that we listened to. So you go to a blues party, and the police would raid and take away your drinks, and go away with it. You wouldn't see it again. They'd take you to court, you'd pay a few pounds. You come back next week, and you'd have another blues party in the same space, yeah? And the police would raid again maybe a month later, but it didn't stop the culture from evolving. So people learned to duck and dive in and out, duck and dive. And eventually you get to the point where you started to be able to find corrupt policemen, and they would take your drink and give it to you back the next day. So that was the kind of community. And then of course, Brixton was the place where a lot of the traders were Jewish. And they being outsiders as well, because they went, I mean, looking at the history of Brixton, the Jews, because one of the main synagogues was actually in Brixton. And it's now called is it C-Link? It's not C-Link, it's Eurolink building. That was a very important synagogue in South London. And so most of the traders were Jewish. And being outsiders, they kind of had a kind of sympathy for Caribbean people. And of course they see it as an exploitable commodity, these new people coming in. So they would provide us with the food that we needed. So you got all the Caribbean provisions like yam, green bananas, and all that kind of stuff. They would make sure that the people had access to. And so I remember my father going to the first day my father took me through the market and introduced me to all these Jewish traders, that this is his son and he's just come from Jamaica. So if he comes to buy, you make sure you take care of him. And I remember once my father talked about red herring, which is smoked herring, dry smoked herring. And these Jewish guys said, how is it done? And my father explained. And a couple of weeks later, a couple of months later, they had dried red herrings for sale. You understand? So you could get all the things, salted mackerel, salted beef, salted pork, whatever you needed to cook in the way that you cooked in the Caribbean. It would be in Brixton. And so people would come from all over to Brixton. So if you go to Brixton on a Saturday, the community would meet there from Balham, Peckham, wherever, and they would come and they would see each other. People they haven't seen for years. They would then have an encounter and they'd walk down and meet someone else. And that was the way that early community evolved into a community. But most of them lived outside of that central area, you see.
One aspect that we were exploring was the fact that it was very difficult to find housing, and the collectivization of people to pool money, pool resources, so that people could start to purchase homes and start to set down roots. How did that function for your family?
Well, in Jamaica, they've got a kind of communal way of saving money. And in Jamaica, it's called a partner, as in partner. It's a partnership of X number of people who come together. And they usually, and there's a banker, and the banker usually know all the people. So if if the banker isn't able to trust the person, they won't be part of the collective because you could get your money and run off and not come back. And the banker would be responsible. In the Eastern Caribbean, it's called susu, but in Jamaica, it's partner. So that was how a lot of people were able to acquire enough funds to pay a deposit on a house. The building societies and banks wouldn't lend black people. You know, it's like it just wasn't done. They would argue that they don't know you, they don't know the community, so they're not going to trust you with their money. So a lot of people actually throw a hand. So each week you throw a hand, which would be £10. If there are 10 people in it and each throw £10, you have £100, and one person would get what is known as a draw, that week's accumulation of £100, and then it would go all the way around. So you could end up with when it gets to the end of the cycle, you will be the last person, but you would also be the first person on the next round of 10. So you would get what they call last and first. So you would get the £100 of this one that ends, and the next week you get £100 of the new cycle. So you'd have £200, which often is enough to deposit on a house, right? And that's what most people did back then. In fact, you still have partners going, but people will throw in £100 a week, £200 a week. So when they draw at the end of the cycle, they could have £2,000 or £3,000 or £4,000 or £5,000. Yeah, and so that's how a lot of them were able to get the deposit. You couldn't get the deposit from the building societies or the banks. Just a no-no. The local council, however, you could actually get. So, like my parents got mortgage loan from the local authority, but that was a very small percentage of the community. And so people would rent a room. Yeah, so you'd buy the house, you'd get the mortgage on the house, you split it up, you'd live in one room and you rent all the other rooms. You'd have a cooker on the landing, a communal cooker, everybody, yeah? Often the houses didn't have baths, so you'd have to come down to Campbell Green, to the public bath, once a week or once a fortnight to have a wash. And so that's what the community evolved out of. So most people, and in those days, the council, Lambeth Council, weren't giving houses to black people. Yeah, because, you know, white people suffered, they got bombed out, the houses, the new flats were built, and they had priority. They had to take care of their own people. Yeah, but after a while, by the time you got to the mid-70s, people weren't taking that anymore, and there's a lot of protest about the allocation of council dwellings, and that's when black people started to be moved into. And of course, there's a huge project where we lived, just round the back from here, where they bought out all the houses on a compulsory purchase order to build a motorway from the Oval here to Streatham, which never materialized. And so a lot of the early community in this area lost out on the compulsory purchase act. But, you know, there were real communities of people who actually knew each other, and of course, because they had the common Jamaicanness, it was easy for them to mix and build that. Yeah. So you had not far from here, if you go up Vassal Road, you come to Elliott Road, turn right, and you go in, and there's a huge community there. They had their own grocery shops. The Jamaican Chinese had grocery shops. There's an African Jamaican who had a grocery shop. They had the first takeaway restaurant called Hillside in that area. My mother's cousin had a shebeen in the basement. And so all the stuff right there in that little community. And you know, the indigenous people were quite friendly. They weren't over-friendly, but they weren't aggressive and they weren't unfriendly. So you knew everybody, the sweet shop owner, the pub landlord, and he would invite you. And he was very friendly, a guy called Wren at the Mustang Arms. And then, you know, the greengrocers. And in those days, the greengrocers, the floor was made of dirt. Or maybe it's just the dirt from the potatoes that accumulated. But it was dirt, and it kind of reminds you of back home, where everything was on the floor, the dirt. So you'd sweep the yard, you'd sprinkle and sweep the yard, sprinkle to stop the dust from, yeah? But it's just compact, clay, compact soil. And in the greengrocers, it was like that, you know, so you were home, and he was friendly, you know? So that was that kind of community. And maybe I've drifted away from your question, which was, how did the community evolve? Yeah, and that was it. So the center of the community is the banker for the partner, yeah, and everybody would bring their money on a Friday evening, and then on a Saturday, whoever's turn it was to collect would come, and of course, and then you would give the banker maybe a £5 or a £10 for doing all that kind of work, because it's done gratuitously. It's not, you know, there's no money taken from it. And so that's, you know, that's how it actually evolved. And as young teenagers and stuff, we all knew each other. We used to go around to the park, the local park, and play cricket, play football. And we used to go to Brockwell Park, to the Lido, and all of us, new group of young black people, meeting up for the first time. We used to go to what is now the Fridge. That used to be the ABC in Brixton. This is like late 50s. All teenagers. And they would come from as far as Peckham, Balham, and they'd meet on a Sunday at the ABC. But of course, in the Caribbean, the cinemas are open. Yeah, it's not closed in. Beautiful tropical plants growing and stuff. And we would go, but we would behave as though we were in the Caribbean. With the open air, we'd be in the cinema shouting and screaming and shooting up in the sky, and when the cowboys come on. And of course, the indigenous people could not believe what was happening, because, you know, they're very, well, this is how we saw them, as really stiff. You can't do that. You know, it's like everything is this way. And there we were, blowing the place apart with our laughter, running around and not paying any regard to the fact that you have to be this way. And then they banned us from there, from there for 6 months. And we ended up going down to the academy, which is now the one in Stockwell Road. It used to be the Odeon, beautiful Art Deco place. But it had no spirit, it was dead. It wasn't like the energy of the ABC. And we were there for a while, and then I think some of us discovered the West End for the first time as young people. And so that gang just kind of drifted apart, and some, like myself, ended up in the West End.
What do people feel when people were being turned down for loans, or, you know, was it a shock? Had people expected something completely different?
Well, I don't know what people were expecting, because most of the people who came, I would say 95% of the people who came, came to England at that time, were working class people, lower working class in, say, Kingston, peasants in the countryside in Jamaica. And therefore they lacked a quality and level of sophistication, like my father, for example, who couldn't read or write in any sophisticated way. Very basic. He could count and he would do his arithmetic and stuff, but he couldn't read or write. My mother only read the newspapers and the Bible. So the level of sophistication was pretty low. And their expectations, however, was that this was the mother country, and that they had come to help the mother country rebuild after the war, because people like Enoch Powell, who was Minister of Health or something, went round the Caribbean recruiting nurses. The same man who then talk about rivers of blood. So they would come believing in a very naive way or a very unsophisticated way that they'd come to help the mother country in reconstructing after the war. But when they came across signs like, you know, no blacks, sorry, no coloreds, no dogs, no Irish. No, Irish is always at the bottom. No coloreds, dogs, or Irish. And that's quite an important one if you spend time figuring out why the Irish was below the dog and the black. They didn't expect that. They expected some kind of welcoming, but there was none. And then when you look historically at, say, at the same time they were coming in, the indigenous people were going out. They were going to Australia. So here there are thousands of them running away to Australia on assisted passage of £10. You with me? When they get to Australia, they would find some kind of committee that would settle them in, some kind of, what do you call it? I can't find the word at the moment. But the committee's duty was to induct them into Australian ways and Australian life, the climate, the environment, the food, so on and so on. When we came here, there was nothing like that. But my father spent £75. You understand? You know how much £75 in today's money in 1956? £75 was the passage to England so that we could come and help the mother country. And it would be several £1,000s in today's money, right? My father, however, earned £1.30 a week. Not £1.30, 30 shillings, which was 30 shillings is £1.50 each week. And out of that, he had to feed himself, his wife, and 2 children and save up enough money to come to England, to pay £75 to come to England. So, you know, there's a kind of gross injustice there, a real gross injustice, which a lot of us couldn't get over. And I haven't gotten over it. You know what I'm saying? So there was that always under the surface when we discovered that white Britons were going to Australia, £10 assisted passage, and we were paying £75. We come here and we weren't welcome. Same people who should have been rebuilding this, running away to Australia, we're coming to build it, and yet there's a color bar. My first job, I went for an interview after leaving school. I went to the British Rail Archives Museum, which was where the Eurostar was at Waterloo. Is it Waterloo? Yes. They knocked it down to build the I went in, and the youth exchange sent me. Yeah, I did a very basic arithmetic test, a very basic English test, which I passed. The guy then looks at me and he says, well, you know, this is not a job for colored people. This is not a job for colored people. But I wasn't aware that there was a law that enforced color bar. It's many years later that I realized there's a law that's under the title, not of pure European descent. And that law was passed just at the end of the First World War. And what it did was bar outsiders from any kind of job in Britain. And what jobs were here was for the boys who would come back from the front. Yeah? And that law went all the way down in many different and varying and subtle ways, right down until the 1960s, when one of the immigration acts of the 60s kind of phased it out. You understand? So we were living under this. So if you talk to black people who lived here in the 1920s and 30s, couldn't work. They were born here, but they couldn't work. So they had to, unless they were in the entertainment and the showbiz, and there were lots of them, but nothing else. So that was the environment that we came into. Most of us grew old, lived, died, never understood that. in its kind of complexity and depth. Young people like me, I left school at 16, never went back, but I've been reading Jung, Freud, Aristotle, Plato ever since then, and traveled all over the place, going to all kinds of places where most of black people wouldn't go into. Look at things that most of us would just kind of shun. So I have an understanding of not just this world, but the world of Africa, the world of things African, Asian, Far East. I lived in Hong Kong for a year, you understand? So I kind of got to understand that, practice Hindu meditation and Hinduism to a depth that I could understand it, make it, get comparative sense between the African thought systems, the European thought systems, and the Asian. And so you have a sense of the world based on that. Most of the people I grew up with, most of them never read a book. You understand? So the question of what sense can you make of all of this? Most of them couldn't answer that, you see. But this is my home. I went back to Jamaica after 30 years and the people not just treated me, but called me a foreigner. You can't criticize what's going on in Jamaica. You're a Jamaican, you're a foreigner. You left Jamaica before it became independent anyway, so you're a foreigner. So I came back thinking that, no, I am a foreigner in reality, because I spent most of my life here. I understand this in its contemporary sense far more than I understood Jamaica in its contemporary. I remember it in the 1940s and 50s, but that's not enough to understand Jamaica. It's not enough to be a Jamaican, to understand the subtleties. Whereas I know the subtleties, how to deal with this on a subtle level, how to survive within it, and how to even nudge in my own little way, as you can see on my website and so on. You nudge and say, well, there is another way of seeing all this reality. Check it out. Well, people they can only make choices based on what is given. And a lot of what happened in Britain at that time came from Jamaica. Not Britain, black people in Brixton, Jamaicans in Britain. Because I came here in 1957, Jamaica got its independence in 1962. The music industry, the sound system, I don't know if you know the sound system, evolved in the early 1940s, mid 1940s, when there was they opened a technical college in Kingston, and they taught engineering, electronic, whatever, and people started building amplifiers. And music started to be brought in by local people as opposed to the JBC, which is Jamaica Broadcasting Corporation, playing the music for them, which was often English music, which they didn't understand, or American music, white pop music from America. One or two, you might Nat King Cole and people like that, they would play. But a lot of men used to go off to America as farm workers on short-term contract to go and cut sugarcane in the South, in Florida, pick oranges, cut sugarcane in Florida and also pick oranges. And they would be exposed to music that black people in America, because in those days, you remember there was a race music, right, which was tightly controlled within, and there was no crossover into white. Rarely white people, some brave white people would penetrate and get into it. People like Elvis Presley were able to penetrate the race music and became king of it. However, these guys used to bring back the music to Jamaica because they short-term contract, 3 months, they would come back with records and the latest American style, fashion. So the sound system men used to play them that kind of music, and they would wait on the farm workers to bring the music in. Yeah? So it was this always black blues music or blues derivatives, like Fats Domino in New Orleans, totally different to music from Chicago, which was an urban blues, which was completely different. People like Muddy Waters come out with that stuff. They leave the South and go up and become urbanized, and then they would produce a different to the folk holler and the you know the field music and the folk tunes of the South. They went up to the North in an urban, and they became urbanized the music, and that was the music that brought back to Kingston, urban U.S. music, urban Kingston. And so the music became, American music became really central. But in 1955, I think, Laurel Atkins, because the sound men used to, the farm workers would bring the music for the sound system men. Because now you had about 3 sound systems in Kingston. Reed, one guy called, that's in West Kingston, you had Count Saxon in East Kingston, and you'd have Tom the Great Sebastian, another West Kingston man. And these were the big sounds. And Duke Vin, you saw the video of Duke Vin, the first sound system man in London. In England, he used to spin for Tom the Great Sebastian. So there's a whole culture now springing up. And then Studio One, who's it, Reed? Studio One, he's the one who produced Bob Marley, first music, right? Decided that he was gonna cut music. Instead of, because what they did was they have one copy and they'd scratch the information off it. So, and they'd put their own kind of symbol and they would play the music, play that music. And they might be the only sound system with that tune. So people would come from far and wide just to listen to that one unique. And so the competition. But Studio One, I think it's Duke Reed, if I'm not mistaken, decided he would record his own music. And that's when people like Bob, the Wailers, started to record. So he would then record them and have one copy. So it was music that was recorded to be distributed. It's just one copy for himself, for his sound. So if you want to hear the Wailers, you come to a Duke Reed dance. So that's what was going on there. Parallel here, you had Count Suckle. Have you heard of Suckle, the Q Club? And Duke Vin, and they both stowed away from Jamaica on the same ship, came here. And both, well, Vinny was the one who started first, then Suckle followed. Now they then started to play the music here. And this is the new music. And what happened was the new music coming out of Jamaica carried the latest language, the latest phrases, the latest cultural whatever came up in the music. So you had to hear the music to know what was going on out there. And so, of course, the music became central because we didn't have a newspaper like we have now that's like The Voice or The Gleaner. Here you get a Gleaner posted once a month, a couple of Gleaners rolled up, dropped through the letterbox once a month. But to keep in touch with the changes out there, the cultural, the fashion, the language, it was through the music. So everybody became part of that music. And then gradually we started to play it here. And thanks to Blackwell, Chris Blackwell, Island Record, who used to produce the music there and have it here, put it in the back of his Mini and take it round and sell it on a Saturday. He then realized that you could use the same music, but front it with white musicians. And that was the birth of island music. So he then penetrated the white youths with reggae music. It wasn't called reggae at that time, it was ska. The first version was da 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 da. Yeah? And the white kids just went totally berserk right, over this music, which gave us a kind of opening because we could then play the music and go make some money off of them. And that's how a lot of us started out in the kind of music because of the euphoria of the mods. Yeah? And then, of course, the fashion came up from Jamaica, which was a little stingy brim hat, the mohair suit, the mohair and tonic, short, tight, winkle picker shoes. That was what came from Jamaica, and the mods picked that up. And that was their mode of dress, as opposed to the rockers with long, greasy, and they would listen to Chuck Berry and that kind of rock and rolly kind of music, whereas the mods were into right? And it transformed British society. And, you know, not a lot of credit is given for that. And a lot of the early white bands like the Small Faces, the Moody Blues, even Sir Elton John, you'll hear him talk about going into the West End and to listen to sound system music, and a Roaring Twenties and a Q Club. And that's where he got his stuff from. Yeah? So it was something that everyone was interested in because you had to keep in touch with what was going on there. And if you can play it, then why not? You go down to Brighton, you go up to Manchester, all over the place playing the British version of that. And so but I never saw myself as a professional musician. I never took it seriously. You know what I mean? I enjoyed it. I, run around, make friends, socialize. And of course, I used to play congas and flute. And of course, the conga player was a really sexy one. So, all the girls would kind of flock the conga player. But that's not what you want to hear. But that's how it was. But I never saw myself as a serious musician. And then I had a drum kit in the basement. My brother came back from Italy where he'd kind of got stranded for some months. He came and he saw the drum kit and he started to practice on it. And he became, he's still playing. If you look up Sam Kelly, anywhere you'll find, blues drummer of the year for several years. And it started off with, but I was playing congas, but I bought the kit and left it there and just to practice on. And then there's a group of Guyanese musicians, a bass player and a guitar player. And they used to play this really obtuse music, and they invited me into the band. And it was neither jazz, neither was it R&B or calypso or anything. It was just so, it was like Roland Kirk. I don't know if you know the jazz musician Roland Kirk. Very obtuse. And we used to improvise and play for hours and hours without any theme, without anything, just pure improvisation. I left and went to Italy for a month. Not Italy, around Europe, camping. Went to Italy, started in Italy, and camped all over, ended up in Switzerland, down in Belgium, and then back. When I got back, they'd reorganized the band. And they had all these horn players, another conga player. My brother was now the drummer in the band. My cousin, one of the tenor players. And they said, well, this is the band. But I never felt, because it was all very structured arrangements, and you have a solo here, and the singer sings that. And whereas before, we just played and improvised continuously. I never really felt a part of the band. But that band became Simandi, or Simandi. I don't know if you looked them up, right?
My dad's a percussionist, and so he has a few of the albums.
Oh, right. So that was the band. But I wasn't going to sign a contract because I got conned not long, about a couple of years before, where some guys came along, saw the band I was playing with, took us into the Abbey Road studio, same studio the Beatles, and recorded a whole set of tunes, and then came back and gave us a bottle of brandy. We never saw them again. But a year later, we went into a record shop. They were selling K-Tel. K-Tel was this cheap label, and I saw all my music on it. So it was like, no, this is not for me. So we recorded the first session at a studio down off the Edgware Road, and the guys decided they were going to sign a contract And I said I wasn't going to sign a contract. So the very first album has got myself playing congas on it. And the second album's got one of my compositions. And then I left the band because I wasn't going to sign because I felt the music business was a rip-off. But my first experience was a serious rip-off. No, not gonna, there's no way. And so I left the band. But I'm playing around and I'm playing around. And while I was practicing my flute, however, because, you know, the flute's far more intensive than the congas. So I'd locked myself away for 2 or 3 weeks in the room I used to share with the woman I was living with. And I just arpeggios, scales in different keys up and down, because that's what you have to master to play jazz, because you simply just pull them in and string them together and you make whatever it is. And I got so intensely wound up with that, I decided I needed something to kind of release, and so I went out and bought some clay from a craft shop, Reeves, on Kensington High Street, and started to model in clay to release that tension. Did that for a couple of years. And so I've got a couple of pieces that I created back then. Those are my first pieces of art. And they came out of the need for relaxation from the intensity of practicing the flute. And then I kind of drifted away from that into art. I went as but I did everything, you know, sound engineer. Sound, I would build my own amplifiers and stuff as a child. I decided one day I was going to do photography because my uncle gave me a Brownie box camera, which I brought from Jamaica. I took some pictures and went up to a place in Brixton. I wanted to learn how to print, how to develop and print. I said, oh, here's some universal chemicals. And there's the thing, you put it in and you shake it up and stuff. So, because most of the pictures on the website are my photographs and the videos are my stuff. So it was always a jack of all trades, but never mastered any until I decided one day that I'd done a masterpiece as a sculptor. I'd reached, and so I gave myself a new name, the name of the sculptor, which is a Yoruba word meaning one who creates with the hand. It's a name for the artist. And it's FOWOKAN, FOWOKAN. And that's the word, that's the name that is under all my work comes under. Yeah? So when I arrived at the point where I decided, no, I've produced a masterpiece, so I'm now a sculptor, I decided I wasn't going to touch music anymore. So I put my flute down and my drum. 1979 was the last time I played my drum in a band, in a pub in Clapham. So that was my music. And I I listen to music. I can't work without having jazz music in the background. At nights, I have classical music going all through the night. But that's the only time I listen to classical music. I don't listen to it seriously. It's there to keep me company in the middle of the night when I can't sleep. But jazz music is the music I listen. I listen to everything, R&B thing, but I don't like the modern stuff. I don't feel it's a bit like conceptual art. You blow up some condoms and you stick them up on a wall and you write 10,000 word essay and you've got a piece of art. But I feel you need to create a bronze that will be here 5,000 years from now. Just like you go into the temples and the museums in Egypt, you find African art, African/Egyptian art that goes back thousands of years. And I think we should, in our philosophy, strive towards perpetuity into infinity, not to come to an end. It's throwaway.
So when did it become more about leaving something behind that you felt was important for people, particularly with regards to having a connection with African art and being able to give that a platform?
Well, it's a long, long story. You know, the story goes back to Jamaica as a child, going to the cinema and seeing all the negative expressions of the African. It's the negative expression of the African in the schoolyard, where, you know, we tease each other. If you're dark, you're an African. You live in a tree, you have a tail. That was and of course within the plantation society, the plantation hierarchy, with the newly arrived unsophisticated African at the bottom and the European master at the top, and the Creoles and the mix all the way up to the master. And that is enshrined within Caribbean society. It's enshrined within African American society also. Nobody will talk about it, but it's a reality. So that those who are closer to the what they call the Congo Bongo, which are the unsophisticated ones who never left the plantation or the rural areas, you know, so that they're always at the bottom, and then you measure yourself against how far up or how far down you are. So when we're in the cinema, for example, in the 1950s, and we see images of the black, often in Tarzan movies, and they're real idiotic savages running up and down, you know, like, I don't know if you've read Heart of Darkness. Yeah, these were the characters that were realized, and that's all we had of black people. Or Stephen Fetchit. Stephen Fetchit was the one who rolled his eyes and go, "Yes, the boss, sir. Yes, the boss." And whenever Stephen Fetchit come off, we would turn around and in a state of total embarrassment. And that's all we were fed as children growing up when we went to the cinema. And cinema was a very important part of our lives. It's the only entertainment, apart from the radio, and the radio was dominated by Jamaica Broadcasting. It's a version of the BBC. So there wasn't anything on it for us. So that's what we had to kind of struggle with. And of course I came here and I met real Africans who didn't have tails. They came to go to university, highly sophisticated, politically infused, and so on. So it transforms. Then I went to the Horniman Museum, which is somewhere up the road from here, and I saw the Benin bronzes, depiction of African kings, noble, not noble savages, but noble, quality of nobility of the kings, the queen mother with the hair, the warriors, and so on. And I couldn't believe it. That here I could see myself reflected in a really, really, truly positive way. And it transformed me. I went home and started carving. I bought a piece of wood and started carving African masks and spears and shields and stuff. So that was really my first kind of, if you like, encounter with a positive Africa. And that kind of went on for some time. And I got a job as a sound engineer with Jimmy Cliff. After I came back from the US, I was out there for about 5 months with Samandi, kind of managing them, doing the road managing, sound engineer, everything. And I came back, I was recommended to Jimmy because he had to go to Nigeria to do a series of gigs and he needed somebody and they recommended, and I went off. And it was a kind of life-changing experience because I set foot on Africa for the first time. And when I looked around, I recognized all the people. There's my grandmother, there's my aunt, there's the old woman from next door in Lagos. And it totally blew me away. But the place had such an electric current flowing through it that you could actually hold on to it and it would vibrate. And we went to see the Oba. And the Oba is the temporal leader. He's the king of the Yoruba people. And in Benin, because he's like the king of Benin. And we had an audience with this man. And I came back thinking, my God, I never thought, because you got, in the Ife, which is a place in Nigeria, which is the spiritual home of the Yoruba people, the spiritual leader is the Oni, yeah? And Onis are reproduced, and if you look them up at the British Museum, they've got a good collection of Ife images. You see some incredible, absolutely incredible pieces of art produced by these priests, because you have the Oba, the Oni, and then you have the priestly caste, who are the Ona, O-N-A, the Onas, and they are the priests. But they're not just priests who go around, what? To worship. They are the ones who are the intermediaries between the spiritual leader on earth and the great god Olodumare, right? So they bring the messages from Olodumare, yeah? And when the Oni dies, it's their job to reproduce that Oni in a commemorative bust, so you get the head. Most incredible things. You should look them up. Yeah, so you got the Oba, which is the temporal, the Oni, the spiritual leader, and then you have the Ona, or the Onas, and they are the priests. Now, in African culture, like in a lot of early traditional cultures, there was no such thing as art for the sake of art. It's just like in Europe as well. It had to have a purpose. Art isn't for the sake of doing. And so these guys were the sculptors who created the bronze. But bronze were those bronze were only created by initiates who had gone through and become priests, who then had the know-how, which is highly technical, because even now European experts can't figure out how those bronzes were cast, because they're not real bronze, they're more copper. When you pour copper into the mold, it tends to stick. And their things could be 0.5 millimeter thick, yet they were able to cast these things. And so, it has to be some kind of divine intervention, if you like, that creates those things. So you get to understand, and so of course, if you look at an African mask, there were no mask makers who make masks for a living. Yeah, the blacksmith, the whatever, comes at a certain time of the year when you need a mask for a particular ritual. The blacksmith will come out and carve you the mask. Very highly skilled stuff, because if you look at some African masks, they're perfect in the technical whatever. But they're not made by artists who sit on them, create things and put it in the marketplace. Yeah? So that was my greatest dilemma. What kind of artist am I? You understand? Am I making this thing to put it in the marketplace? Or is it for some greater purpose? Is it to express in a ritual way how our ancestors created ritually, not as a commodity? And so that's been one of the biggest kind of struggle for me. So, like some people will go off to university and learn to do this. I didn't do any of that. I had a talent from a child because, we had to make our own stuff in Kingston. Those at the bottom of the hierarchy couldn't afford to go and buy a store-bought, some kind of store-bought toy. You had to make it. So the hands were always there from an early age, being able to create, you see. And so, but then I look around and I look at the philosophies that were in vogue, the ideas that were in vogue, and realize that all of it still carried this step and fetch it, the natives from the heart of darkness kind of thing. And nobody, including the Africans themselves, who were running away from all of that because the pressure of Europe and European ideas to transform them away from that make them into kind of like cardboard cutout Europeans. You know, they'll never be Europeans. I'll never be a European. Even though I've got Irish, Welsh, and Scottish blood running, you know, I'm rejected. Because, you know, you got 50% white parents, 50% black parents, and what are you? 100% black. So almost as if you were rejected. And I feel if people reject me, I shouldn't strive. You know what I'm saying? I should accept the rejection and go off and create my own stuff. So even though I've got all those blood in there, I don't see myself. Because in rejecting you, they take away all the liberties that whites are entitled to. You can't, just like the color bar. You know, once you divest the children, and most mixed race children struggle with that one, because they can see themselves being dumped upon the crap pile, where their mothers or their fathers, being white, have all the prerogatives. And they can see how the prerogatives have been taken away from them. And they're dumped on the crap pile with the black. You understand? So I never strove to become. I left school at 16, never went back to school. But I read Jung and Freud. And in reading Jung and Freud, I discovered that Jung went to Africa and lived in Uganda among the so-called tribesmen, studying them going in and out of trance. Because Africans will just like that and go into a state of trance. You understand me? So he sees them going in and out of trance, and out of the study comes what? Notions of the subconscious and the unconscious, which is purely Jungian. It's nothing to do with Freud. Freud, in fact, had problems with the unconscious. But the unconscious come out of the African. The unconscious is the most natural thing to go in and come out of, the trance state. And when they invited him to go into a trance, he refused and ran away. This is the great Jung. So little things like that says to me, but wait a minute, man. There is something there I need to understand. I need to penetrate, because that thing is within me as well. All I need to do is find a way of, being able to channel it. And as I evolved learning, teaching myself how to create art, I realized that I can put the unconscious into it. I can put the subconscious. I can put the metaphysical, the metaphorical into all these things that I express. So none of them is a throwaway. You know, none of them are throwaway objects. They all have a purpose, and they're full of all kinds of divine expression, to use a really arrogant phrase, divine expression, because nobody else ain't doing it. Even the brothers in Africa know, because pressure from Europe that you need to get rid of that barbarous thing. You need to become good Christians. You understand? They reject all that. So that is something that's pushed underneath in a secret place. And I'm saying, I'm not going to push it under, because I understand it to a degree, and I understand that it has to be made part of not just our, as black people, universe. It has to be a part of everybody's universe. Just like you can go to the British Museum and see those great stone heads of the African pharaohs with the crown of the pharaoh, which Europeans for a long time couldn't accept that they were pharaohs, but they had to be great warriors. Or you can go into the Africa room and see Benin bronzes. You can see bronzes from Ife. And these are gifts to the world. The British Museum would never give them back to Africa. You understand? They are priceless. Now, if the British Museum can say this is priceless and put that kind of value on it, then I feel I can put a value on stuff that is African as well. So I produce it and put it out there and deal with it. Deal with it.
That's excellent. And when you're producing bronzes and sculptures in general, how long did it take for you to get to the point where you felt like you could call, like, that you were now a sculptor? This is what you did. was that transition period for you with the experimentation and the working with the different mediums?
Somebody asked me that question a couple of weeks ago, and because I talked about when I created a piece that I felt was a masterpiece, and therefore I am now a sculptor. And I couldn't give them an answer. The answer I gave them was, being in Africa, bought a pair of rubber tire sandals, which the Rastas, when they first came down out of the hills in Jamaica, wore. They were called power sandals. And I came back to London in 1975 and decided there was all this power that I experienced. Got to find some way of channeling it. And I saw the sandals and I made a copy of that. And that was the first time I intentionally did anything in that kind of way. And that led to me making a whole lot for the carnival in '76. And this Jewish friend of mine sold some for me. He says, make an illustration like a poster to say what they were. And I then made this poster with a Rasta head coming out of a tire, which I then made silkscreen of, and the rest is history. But in this new phase of creating art, I had a dream one night. I was up in Balham with a lady friend of mine. Woke up and I had a dream in the middle of the night that I could actually use ceramide plaster. You know, ceramide, it's the finishing plaster that you use to plaster the walls. That I could make sculptures from that. And I got up on the way home, I bought a bag of this ceramide plaster and started sculpting. But what happened was that using ceramide plaster and that method of making like a slurry, with water and stuff, and then building up a shape, is actually modeling, because you model by adding. And then you build the shape up, and then you chip it away when it hardens, you then chip it away, which is sculpting. So that out of that dream came the kind of solution to all the technical stuff that I needed to master, which is to model and to sculpt. So a lot of the early pieces were a combination of modeling and sculpting. And then I got to a point where I thought, no, man, and all the pieces were smoothly finished, like a Benin bronze would be, clean. I'm thinking, no, man, I'm not going to allow, because what I was avoiding using soft clay and doing everything in soft clay, which a lot of European modeling sculpture, so it's soft and you can see the fingerprint and you can see the stroke in it. I'm thinking, no, man, I'm not going to let the Europeans dominate this and keep me out of it. I'm going to go in there and do that as well. And I did a piece called, if you look up on the site, you'll see a piece called Man from Redemption Ground, which is an old man with a beard kind of looking down. You know the one? That was the first piece I did out of soft clay. And as it evolved, it was just throwing the clay together. I remember, because I worked as a postman in the West End, and there was a brother who was a Rasta man, but the earliest Rasta men didn't have dreadlocks. They had beard, and they were known as beard men. Yeah? They were the intellectuals and the artists before they became Rastas, right? And this guy's name was George Fairclough, and he looked just like that piece. And he used to talk about all the philosophies around the Rastafarian beliefs, the rituals. There's rituals, they would come and smoke and drum for a week and reason, intellectual, whatever. And that would go on for a whole week, and he would talk about these things. But he was like 6'6" tall and had this magnificent beard and this long, elongated face. And that's, as the piece evolved, it became George Fairclough. Yeah? Because he would tell us stories about at the end of slavery, when the governor came to read the manumission papers, in Kingston, there was an area that was called Redemption Ground, or it became Redemption Ground, which was the place where the slaves were redeemed from or the enslaved was redeemed from slavery, and it's called Redemption Ground. And there's a market there now. But he talked about it as a sacred space. You see, the sacred space is where they were redeemed. It's where their redemption took place. And so I named the piece after the grong. Grong is ground. So redemption grong is the ground that was redeemed, or the people who were standing on the ground were redeemed. Yeah? So Man from Redemption Grong reminds me of the stories of the day the governor general, not general, but the governor of Jamaica read the papers about the freeing of those enslaved people. So that kind of took me up another path, yeah, from the highly polished. But I prefer the highly polished because it sits within the Benin bronze and even the wood carving tradition, where it's polished and it's a clean, unspeckled kind of surface. But Man from Redemption Ground speaks quite clearly of George Fairclough and of the stories of redemption, which people are still struggling with, but have no idea what they're being redeemed from or redeemed into. So there's a lot of confusion out there at the moment with black people.
And throughout that period, whereabouts were you working? You said you're a postman in the West.
Yeah, well, by then when I went to Nigeria, when I went to the US with Simandi, by then I became redundant at the post office, and so I was like all over the place. But when I started to do this thing, I was living with an English woman at the time, and I had gone off to Africa. She, when I went off there, it was all happy that I was going off and set foot on ancestral land and stuff. And then I came back with this thing, and she didn't recognize it. Although we were really still quite attracted, this big elephant came between us, which was this spirit because I got stranded out there. You understand? I ended up staying there for about 4 months without any money, without any prospect, because all kinds of confusion, and Jimmy was arrested and thrown into jail. And anyway, when I got back, I came back with this thing, and she encouraged it, but she could see it as this huge elephant between us, that although, she could never be a part of it. It was just a new me that had come back from Africa. And so, I'm living with her, and I started doing things on the dining table. And she worked way over. We're in Shepherd's Bush, and she worked over near Gatwick Airport. And, she'd drive back every evening and drive there in the morning. And I'd have to clean up everything so the house didn't look as if there was somebody hammering and nailing and riveting and chiseling on the dining table before she came back. And of course that couldn't last. And I got a flat. My mom, they bought the house on compulsory purchase and given us a flat. And my mother had put up in Tulsil, yeah, given her a flat. And my name was on the housing whatever list. And they called me and said, there's a flat in Cressingham Gardens. You know, Cressingham Gardens is the one they're thinking about knocking down at the moment. So I got a flat there. And I worked and lived in the space from about 78 until I moved in with my partner, the one I live with now, in 94. But it was the place where most of those pieces were produced. Yeah, but I was on my own, and so if I got up at 4 a.m. to go to the toilet and I walk past and I see the piece, I'd come back or right? But that couldn't last forever. But myself and Brenda, we were good friends because she really believed in what I was doing and helped me as much as she could. But she wanted respectability. She wanted to get married, and I married. I'm still not married. I'm 72, and I'm still, it doesn't matter whether I'm married or not. English common law controls my relationship and all that kind of stuff. So why bother? And if I do, and I do African ceremony, marriage ceremonies, but there's spiritual stuff, because I do all that kind of stuff. Naming ceremonies of babies, initiating of young people into adulthood, wedding, funerals, the whole lot. I'll do because I'm an elder. And in African society, through life and experience and wisdom, you should be able to do those things. Because life isn't about just getting, wealth. You have spiritual wealth that you accumulate also, and you should be aware of accumulating those things. So therefore you acquire the knowledge to recognize spirit, to recognize spirituality, to recognize what to do with the spirituality, because you can use it in a positive, you can use it in a negative kind of way. You can have a man of power who is on the dark side. You can have a man of power who's on the lighter side. And so you make choices as to which one. So I do all those things. My godson died last August, and they asked me to officiate at the thing. I had pour libation and basically do all the African things that was necessary. And because he wasn't a Christian, he didn't want anything Christian around him. And he was cremated, So early this year, a friend wanted to marry a second woman. Yeah? But of course he can't marry in the church or legally within British common or British law, but he can have a spiritual wedding. So it's a ritual transformation of himself, the woman, and the child that the woman was carrying. They're ritually transformed. Nothing to do with a Western notion of anything. It's real and people want to do it, so those of us who can, Devon, when he did his kind of commemoration of his 15 years of marriage, he asked me to come and pour libation and talk about and say, you understand? But these things are necessary within our community because there is nothing spiritual now. Spiritual is a ritual is a no-no because the church is dead. And if the church is dead, then there's no morals, there are no ethics, there's nothing. Any man can do what he wants if he can get away with it. Any woman can do what she wants if she can get away with it. And I don't think that is good for humanity. History has shown us that people need these processes, that there is no such thing as freedom. You can be free within, but you can't be free without. There is no such thing. And what society is forcing us towards is freedom without, not within any kind of confines. And it's a nonsense because there's no such thing as infinite freedom. Yeah, one of those kind of moments of transformation was 1971. And as I said, I got bored with the smoking of cigarettes and then my partner one Sunday cooked a roast beef and it tasted like eating cardboard. And I thought, something has to be done. This other friend, however, used to go to an ashram just off Westbourne Grove, right? And she says, George, why don't you go to check out this ashram? So I went, it was a transformation. I walked in, the man said, give up smoking, give up eating meat, and give up sex. So I thought, well, I've tried a lot of things, why not try this? And in those days, in the swinging 60s towards the end, women, there's at least 3 women living with one, living at home, spending a lot of time with one, and the other 2 who knew about the one didn't know about the other, and it was like that. And the man said, give up cigarettes, give up eating meat, and give up sex. And I gave up sex for a year. I gave up eating meat for 16 years, and I've not smoked since. And and what that did was it took me into Eastern mysticism and Eastern thought systems, because they were Sikhs. These are white British and American, but they got into following one of the gurus, like the Beatles had a guru, and they became initiated and gurus, and they brought it back to England. So I then got into Hinduism, I got into Buddhism, and Sikhism, Jainism, all these isms that I'd never heard of before. And I started penetrating and I started learning to meditate and do yoga. I was able to do all kinds of weird things with my body after about a couple of years. And then I got to understand the thought systems of especially the Hindus, and how close it is to the African. Like, for example, in West Africa, you have in the Yoruba, you have a trickster god, a god of trickery. Hindu, because they've got thousands of, their pantheon has thousands, they also have trickery, the gods of trickery. And you have to pay homage to the god of trickery so that it clears the path for you. Yeah? So by the time you get to Africa, you realize the similarity between these two. That, it's not a personified God, which is what Christianity, and to a certain extent some of these other religions have done. It's the personified God. So I go to the Sistine Chapel in Rome, and I look up at the ceiling and I see this gray-haired white man giving life to this white young man. And that's what we're supposed to believe, that is God. So where am I in there? I can't find me in there. You understand? But you're forced to accept that as some kind of norm. You understand? So most of us reject it. And nowadays, most people have rejected that kind of foolishness. But what do you as an African put in its place? You see? So I realized that these are not, the African thought systems are not about, there are some personifications, but a lot of them come out of, like, the feminine element within, say, the Yoruba people. Most of the feminine elements are based on nature. The wind, the goddess of the wind, the goddess of the fresh water, the goddess of the surface of the sea, the goddess of the deep. And if you go to the exhibition, you'll see the goddess of the deep. Her name is Olokun. And she's the one, in my mind, my explanation, she takes care of the spirit of the dead ones who jumped overboard rather than go into slavery in the Atlantic. Also, you taught the story of the Zong slave ship, where the slaves became ill and they flung them overboard and killed them, came back to London and claimed insurance for them. So she takes care of those. But if you go to the masculine, they're called Orisha. Orisha are like gods, but they're not gods, they're emissaries of the god, the great god Olodumare. Are you following me? So you have the god of iron, iron being a man-made object, is somebody called Ogun. But iron means also bronze, brass, copper, all of those things are iron because they're metal. So but they say he's the god of iron, and he's Ogun. Ogun is also the god of the artist and the creative. Yeah, so those priests who created those bronze worshipped Ogun. But then you have the trickster god, right? And there are those who follow the trickster. But you have to pay homage to the trickster, otherwise the trickster will block your path with trickery. So the first ritual you make is to propitiate trickery. Now, if you go back to the ancient Romans, you hear them say, buyer beware, caveat emptor. Buyer beware of the trickery of the god. Because they, those ancient Romans weren't Christians. They had all these, they had to propitiate the god of trickery. Beware. And the responsibility is yours, not the god of trickery or the worshipper of trickery. So you understand those things through these barbaric, but that religion is one of the most sophisticated and profound of all of them, but yet nobody knows about it. So that was one of my moments of transformation. And it was a really profound one, that giving up everything and starting anew. And out of that came my visit to America, came my year in Hong Kong. So I was able to visit all the shrines, go among the monks and help translate, not translate, but explain stuff in English. Because these monks in their saffron things, and they're reading these really complex philosophical things in English. But their first language is Cantonese. So, you know, I went up to one temple once and they dragged me into this room and explained this to me. And it's like this really complex stuff they're studying about Aristotle. It's like, I had to explain it. So that was a real eye-opener, you know, because I could see the future just standing in Hong Kong with all this stuff going on around me. You could see what's happening in China today is what I saw in Hong Kong in 1972. Energy is raised to bust out and take over the whole world. But at the core, they still believe in their ancestors, and they still believe in the Taoist gods, the gods of nature. They still follow Confucius. You know, communist China, you know, the philosophy that they actually follow is not Marx, it's Confucius. And if you understand it sufficiently, you can understand what they're doing there at the moment. Democracy, what the hell is that? Give a quarter of the world's population democracy. It's just pure confusion.
It makes me wonder, is there any physical place that gives you a feeling of belonging, or do you take that feeling more from the things that you do and the variety of places that you go to? What gives you that feeling of sort of inner sense of identity?
This is my home. This is the place. If I go anywhere, I have to come back here. I'm most at ease here. All that I need to do in terms of a struggle is here. I can't go to Delhi and start a struggle for anything there. But this is the place that I have to struggle, because I have to take back some of what my mom used to call lives. And the word lives is a combination of prerogatives, freedom, liberties. I have to take them back as a black person. They've been taken away from me because I've been denied my African, and I've also been denied my European ancestry. And somehow I have to take them back. And this is the place. I can't go to New York and tell the New Yorkers that they enslaved me for 200 years and then give my country independence but kept all the land, because the land is still crown land. The people, though, they have the vote, but they can't just go and cut up the land because it belongs to the crown. I can't go to New York and struggle there. The struggle is right here, because it's right here that we were enslaved from, who controlled the land and who kept the land even after they gave us independence. So this is the place. He ain't going nowhere else. My mother is buried not far from here. So is my father. My father's up in Streatham somewhere. And so on. I'll be buried here. Well, I won't be buried here. I'll be cremated here. Won't tell you what they'll do with the ashes, though. But I'll be cremated here. But this is the point of struggle. It's the best place to struggle, because it is the metropolitan of the British Empire. And all the kind of iniquities that have been kind of inflicted upon all those colonies started from here. And the proceeds of all that came back here. If you've been watching the programs on British slavery, you'll see it came back here and it transformed this. And I think we are entitled. You can't tell me the ancestors of the current Jamaican people who slaved to build this country should not be able to benefit from any of it because you say they're now independent. And even when they weren't independent, they couldn't come here. Not until the 1948 Immigration Act. It's not immigration, the Nationality Act, that allowed those people from those colonies whose ancestors worked to build this. 1948, the Nationality Act allowed them in. Previously, they couldn't come in. You can't tell me that they're not entitled to what their ancestors' life force. You know, you steal people's life force, turn it into gold and bring it back here, and you leave them over there, and you say, no, they're a bunch of corrupt, whatever. Yeah, right. So if there's any struggle, if there is any transformation, this has to be transformed. And this has to understand that it has to pay reparation. Not reparation in, a lot of people don't understand what reparation means. Print up some fiat money that don't have no value because it's not it's not backed by anything. You just print up a few trillion and give it to the people. Them ain't nothing. That's not reparation. Reparation is deeper than that. It's not money. And that's what we struggle for. We struggle for reparation. We don't struggle for fiat currency. So you put 20 trillion in a bank account somewhere and say, yeah, here we are. This is for your ancestors. We don't want that. We don't even want bars of gold. There's something that is ineffable, something that you can't touch. But we know it and we sense it and we understand it. That's what we want.